He had asked for a sturdy farm wife, plain-spoken and capable, a woman who wouldn't mind chapped hands or a leaking roof. And what stepped down off the Rattlesnake Bend platform instead was a vision in traveling silk with 3 steamer trunks, a hatbox, and a parasol she was holding like it might be called upon to fend off wolves. Jasper Boggs stood by his wagon with her letter in his coat pocket, the one signed Miss C. Pierce, describing herself as a hardworking woman of modest means eager for honest country life, and looked at the vision coming toward him across the platform, and understood, with the calm dread of a man watching a fence about to give way, that something had gone badly wrong somewhere between the matrimonial agency in Kansas City and this platform. "Mr. Boggs," she said, arriving before him with a smile that had clearly been practiced in front of expensive mirrors. "I'm Charlotte Pierce. I do hope I haven't kept you waiting." "You said you were a woman of modest means," Jasper said, because a farmer did not have the patience for polite evasions the way city folk seemed to. "I am," Charlotte said entirely too quickly. "Presently, circumstances change." He looked at the 3 trunks. Modest circumstances don't usually travel with that much luggage. "One packs for all eventualities," she said, chin lifting a fraction, and Jasper Boggs, who had corresponded for 2 months with a woman who wrote plainly about wanting a hard-working life, and had signed every letter with careful, unpretentious script, understood that he had either been the victim of a swindle or was about to become the least likely participant in someone else's very large secret. He loaded her trunks onto the wagon anyway, because a man raised right didn't leave a woman standing on a platform arguing with her own luggage, and because the alternative, putting her straight back on the next train, seemed, for reasons he couldn't yet name, like more trouble than it was worth. Charlotte Winthrop had been Charlotte Pierce for exactly 11 days, ever since she'd slipped out the servant's entrance of her uncle's Boston townhouse on the eve of her wedding to Alastair Crane, a business associate of her late father's rail line, who had all the warmth of a signed contract and none of the charm, and who wanted her hand mainly for the controlling interest in Winthrop shipping that came attached to it. Her uncle Cornelius had raised her since her parents' deaths with the tender attention a man gives an investment he intends to mature on schedule, and the wedding to Crane had been arranged the way one arranged a merger, without much reference to Charlotte's own opinion on the matter. She had found the real Miss Pierce's letters by accident, tucked in among her lady's maid's things. The maid's own sister, it turned out, corresponding with a Kansas farmer about a mail-order match the sister had ultimately lost her nerve to pursue. And Charlotte, desperate and quick-thinking in the particular way only true desperation produces, had written to Jasper Boggs herself under the borrowed name, packed what she could carry without arousing suspicion, and boarded a westbound train the very night before her wedding was to take place. She had never once, in the whole scheme of it, considered what farm life might actually require of her. She found out within the hour. "There's a milking to do before supper," Jasper told her, once they'd reached the farmhouse, modest, sturdy, well-kept, nothing like the marble and mahogany she'd grown up amid, and somehow, standing in the yard, more welcoming for its plainness than her uncle's townhouse had ever managed to be. "I expect you know your way around a cow, given your letters." Charlotte looked at the cow. The cow looked back at her with an expression she could only describe as deeply unimpressed. "Of course," she said, and approached the animal the way she might have approached a difficult dinner guest. And the cow, sensing inexperience the way animals invariably do, promptly stepped sideways onto the hem of her traveling dress and knocked over the milking stool besides. Jasper watched this entire performance from the barn doorway with his arms crossed, saying nothing, though the corner of his mouth had begun to twitch in a way that suggested he was fighting a losing battle against his own amusement. "You've never milked a cow in your life," he said finally. "I've read about it," Charlotte said, with as much dignity as a woman could muster while extracting her hem from beneath a cow's hoof. "Extensively. Reading about a thing and doing it are different animals entire, Miss Pierce. So I'm discovering—" He took the stool from her and set it right, and showed her, without a single word of mockery in it, how to lean her shoulder into the cow's flank and let her hands do the work instead of fighting the animal for the privilege. And Charlotte, watching his rough, sure hands work, understood she had landed somewhere entirely unlike anything Boston had prepared her for, and found, to her own considerable surprise, that she did not want to leave. Jasper had placed the advertisement, if he was honest with himself, less out of any particular longing for a wife, and more out of the plain arithmetic of 160 acres that could not run itself, and a farmhouse that had gone quiet and echoing since his father's death 3 years back left him the only voice in it most evenings. He had wanted, if he'd let himself examine the wanting closely, someone steady to sit across the table from, someone who wouldn't flinch at hard winters or harder work. And he had told himself repeatedly on the ride to the depot that whatever arrived on that train, plain-spoken or otherwise, would suit him well enough so long as she meant to stay. He had not accounted for a woman who looked at a milking stool like it might bite her and still refused, flatly, to be sent back to the platform in defeat. There was something in that refusal, stubborn and unpolished, that struck him as considerably closer to what he'd actually wanted than anything her careful letters had promised. The first month tested every assumption either of them had brought to the arrangement. Charlotte ruined 2 batches of bread before she understood that yeast required patience rather than force of will, scorched a skillet of eggs badly enough that the cat refused them, and once set an entire basket of mending on fire attempting to heat the flat iron unsupervised. She lost an embarrassing running battle with the chicken coop for the better part of a week, returning to the kitchen each morning with her skirt hem in disarray, and a look of grim determination that made Jasper's hired man, old Pete Dunmore, laugh so hard the first time he near fell off the fence rail watching her chase a particularly disagreeable rooster across the yard. Their nearest neighbor, a sharp-eyed widow named Mabel Cross, who had long nursed a quiet hope that Jasper might one day come calling on her own daughter, took considerable satisfaction in predicting, to anyone in Rattlesnake Bend who'd listen, that the mail-order match wouldn't survive the season. "Mark me," Mabel told the ladies at the Mercantile, well within earshot of Charlotte herself, "a woman who dresses like that and can't manage a chicken coop won't last past first frost. Jasper Boggs deserves better than a fine-boned city creature playing at farm life for want of somewhere else to go." Charlotte, who might once have wilted under such a pronouncement delivered in her uncle's parlor, found instead that Rattlesnake Bend's plain cruelty was considerably easier to bear than Boston's polished kind, if only because there was no pretense dressing it up. She held her chin level, finished her purchases, and went home to practice with the chickens until she'd won the standoff outright, if only to have the private satisfaction of proving Mabel Cross wrong on at least that single count. Jasper, for his part, discovered that a woman who had never scrubbed a floor in her life could nonetheless organize his accounts better in an evening than he had managed in 3 years, could read a contract's fine print faster than the banker in town, and had a way of talking to his cantankerous old mother, who lived in the little house down the lane, that got more sense out of the woman in a week than Jasper had managed in a decade. "She's sharper than she lets on, that one," his mother, Ruth Boggs, told him plainly over Sunday dinner, watching Charlotte attempt badly, but with genuine effort to shape a pie crust at the kitchen table. Sharper than most of the sturdy plain farm girls you claimed you wanted, if you ask me, which you didn't, but I'll say it anyway. She's a mismatch, Ma, plain as day. Mismatches make the best marriages, in my experience, Ruth said. Your father wanted a quiet homebody wife who'd never argue with him, and got me instead, and 40 good years came of it. Don't go confusing what you thought you wanted with what you actually need, son. It's a young man's mistake, and I'd have thought you passed it by now. Jasper did not have a ready answer for that, mostly because his mother was, as usual, entirely correct, and because he had begun, against his own better judgment, to look forward to the particular chaos Charlotte Pierce brought into a kitchen that had been quiet and orderly and lonely for the 3 years since his father passed. Charlotte, for her part, found herself watching for Jasper's return from the fields each evening with an eagerness that alarmed her considerably. Given that she had arrived in Rattlesnake Bend, intending only to disappear, not to feel anything so complicated as affection for the plainspoken farmer she deceived into a false engagement. You never asked why a woman of modest means arrives with 3 trunks of silk dresses, she said to him one evening, unable to carry the guilt of the lie any further without confessing at least a portion of it. Or why I flinch every time a stranger rides up the lane. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready, Jasper said, sitting across from her on the porch step in the blue evening light, whittling a bit of scrap wood the way he did when he wanted his hands occupied while he thought something through. A person's past is their own business till they choose different. That's remarkably generous of you, for a man who ordered a plain, honest bride and got a liar instead. Didn't say you were plain, Jasper said. Said sturdy, and near as I can tell, you've been plenty sturdy about learning things nobody raised you to know how to do. That's not nothing, Charlotte. It was the first time he had used her real name. She had let it slip weeks before, in an unguarded moment, and he had simply absorbed it without comment, the way he absorbed most things, quietly and without fuss, and hearing it in his mouth undid something in her that all her uncle's money had never once managed to touch. My name is Charlotte Winthrop, she said, finally, the whole of it coming loose at once now that the smallest piece had already escaped. I'm not a farmer's daughter of modest means. I'm the sole heir to a shipping fortune my uncle has been managing, and mismanaging, since my parents died, and I ran from my own wedding 11 days before I answered your letter, because the man I was meant to marry wanted my father's company a great deal more than he wanted me. Jasper set his whittling knife down slow and looked at her a long moment in the fading light. That's a considerable thing to run from. I didn't run to you dishonestly meaning to stay dishonest, Charlotte said. I meant to disappear a season, let the wedding scandal die down, and move on somewhere else once I'd saved enough to manage alone. I didn't expect, she stopped, unable to finish it plainly. Didn't expect to want to stay, Jasper finished for her quiet. No, she admitted, I didn't. Ruth Boggs told the truth of it the following morning over coffee, took the news with considerably less alarm than Charlotte had braced herself for. A Winthrop, is it? Ruth said, unbothered, refilling Charlotte's cup as though she'd been told nothing more remarkable than a change in the weather. Can't say the name means much to me, dear, out here. What matters is whether you can be trusted to stay put once the running's done with, and near as I can tell, you've been proving that plain enough these past weeks without needing a fortune to do it for you. You're not troubled that I lied my way into your son's house. I'm troubled by considerably less honest folk than a desperate woman fleeing a wedding she never wanted, Ruth said. You'll find plenty in this world willing to lie for a good deal less noble a reason than staying alive and free. I'd sooner judge you on what you've done since arriving than on the letter that got you here." He didn't say anything more that night, only reached over and took her hand, work roughened now in a way it hadn't been 11 days off that train platform, and held it there in the dark without demanding she explain herself any further. And Charlotte understood, sitting there, that whatever else her old life had cost her, it had at least delivered her to a man who valued her plainly, without reference to a single dollar of Winthrop money. Trouble of a different sort arrived first, in the shape of a summer so dry the creek beds cracked, and the wheat stood stunted and thin in fields that should have stood shoulder-high by July. Jasper had borrowed against the harvest to buy a second plow and a bull for breeding the year before, banking on an ordinary season to cover the note. And an ordinary season was plainly not what the sky intended to provide. "Bank won't extend it," Jasper told her grim, laying his ledger open on the kitchen table one evening, the numbers in it considerably worse than he'd let on, until the drought made pretending impossible. "Not with the wheat looking the way it does. I'll have to sell off stock I can't spare to cover the note come fall, and even then it'll be tight." Charlotte, who had spent a lifetime watching her father's clerks, and later her uncles manage considerably larger sums, with considerably less at stake, took the ledger from him, and spent the better part of 2 evenings going through it line by line, the way she had once helped her father's bookkeeper as a girl, before anyone thought to tell her such things weren't a young lady's proper concern. "You've been paying the Holly's boy full wages through the slow season when half your neighbors let their hired help go till harvest," she said, "and you're carrying interest on the plow note at a rate no bank in Boston would dare charge a farmer with land free and clear behind it. Let me write to the bank on your behalf. I know the language men like that respond to Jasper better than most bankers in Rattlesnake Bend ever will." He hesitated, pride warring plainly with practicality across his face, but the drought did not care for pride, and within the week Charlotte had drafted a letter to the regional bank in language so precisely, coolly persuasive, that the local banker, startled by the sudden appearance of terms he'd never once considered offering a dirt farmer, agreed to extend the note through the following spring rather than force a fall sale at a loss. "Where in creation did a runaway heiress learn to talk to bankers like that?" Jasper asked her, equal parts admiring and bewildered, when the extension came through. "The same place I learned everything else useful," Charlotte said, "watching people with power take advantage of people without it, and deciding, eventually, I'd rather be the exception than the rule." She looked at him, something rower than pride in her face. "I couldn't help you milk a cow to save my life when I arrived, Jasper. But this numbers leverage, the particular language men in fine offices respect, this I know. Let me be useful in the ways I actually can, even if they're not the ways you expected. Didn't send for you on account of what you could do with a bank ledger," Jasper said, though the extension sat between them now as its own quiet proof of something neither had expected the arrangement to yield. "But I'll not pretend I'm not grateful for it all the same." Word of the extension traveled through Rattlesnake Bend the way news of any farmer's fortunes did, and by the time the harvest festival came round in late summer, even Mabel Cross had begun, grudgingly, to allow that the Boggs place looked considerably better tended than she'd predicted it would by first frost. Jasper took Charlotte to the festival dance at the Grange Hall, both of them scrubbed clean of a day's work, and looking, for one evening, like two people who had never once heard of milking stools or bank ledgers. And if the town still whispered a little about the fine city manners underneath her calico dress, the whispers had softened considerably from suspicion into something closer to grudging curiosity. "You dance considerably better than you milk," Jasper told her, turning her through a reel with more confidence than she'd expected from a man who spent his days behind a plow. "I had considerably more practice at dancing than at cows, growing up," Charlotte said, laughing, breathless, happier in that moment. She realized with some surprise than she had been at any ball her uncle had ever paraded her through in Boston. "Though I find I prefer the cow on the whole. Lower stakes and considerably less scheming involved." High praise from a woman who fought that rooster to a standstill. "That rooster started it." He laughed at that properly, the sound of it rare enough that his mother, watching from the refreshment table, caught Charlotte's eye across the hall and smiled in a way that needed no words to explain itself. Walking home under a wide prairie sky thick with stars neither of them could have named the equal of back in Boston. Charlotte asked him, quietly, what had made him place the advertisement in the first place, rather than simply courting one of the local girls the way most farmers his age eventually did. "Watched my father grieve my mother's people's disapproval his whole life for marrying a woman with no family money behind her," Jasper said, after a while. "They never did come around to him, even after 40 years, even after he built this place up from nothing with his own 2 hands. I decided young I wasn't interested in a match built on somebody else's approval. Figured a stranger who wrote plain, honest letters was a safer bet than a local girl whose whole family I'd have to win over besides." He glanced at her, wry. "Didn't account for the stranger having a family fortune and a runaway wedding of her own tucked behind the honest letters, mind you. But I can't say the outcomes disappointed me any. Your father sounds like he loved your mother very much, despite what it cost him." "Cost him plenty, by all accounts. Never once heard him call it a poor bargain, though. Said once that a man who counts the cost of loving somebody properly has already decided the wrong answer before he's finished the sum." Jasper took her hand as they walked, easy now in a way that would have seemed impossible the week she'd arrived. "I didn't understand what he meant by that till here lately." The trouble that followed when it came arrived by train, same as she had. Cornelius Winthrop did not send the Pinkerton man himself. That would have implied an admission that his niece's disappearance was scandal rather than a simple change of travel plans. But he sent one all the same, a quiet, precise fellow named Harmon who arrived in Rattlesnake Bend, asking careful questions at the mercantile and the depot about a young woman traveling alone, fitting a particular description, likely calling herself something other than her own name. Word reached Jasper before it reached Charlotte, carried by his mother, who'd heard it from the storekeeper's wife. "There's a man in town asking after a runaway heiress," Ruth told her son, grim about it. "Description fits your Charlotte close enough it can't be coincidence. You'd best decide plain and quick whose side you're standing on, because that fellow won't be shy about turning up at your door." Jasper found Charlotte in the kitchen, kneading bread with considerably more skill than she'd managed her first week, and told her plainly what his mother had said, watching the color drain slowly from her face. "He's found me," she said, hands going still in the dough. "Or Uncle Cornelius has, which amounts to the same thing. He won't have sent a man all this way for sentiment, Jasper. He'll have sent him to bring me back, by whatever means proves necessary, because the trust doesn't fully vest to Crane's benefit until I'm married, and my uncle has a great deal riding on that arrangement proceeding as planned. Then we'll deal with the man plain, same as we've dealt with everything else. You don't understand what you'd be standing against. My uncle has lawyers, money enough to make trouble for anyone who crosses him, connections that reach considerably further than Rattlesnake Bend. I never should have let this go on as long as it has. I should have told you the whole truth the first week and spared you whatever's about to arrive at your door on my account." Charlotte, Jasper said her name the plain, steady way he said most things, and it stopped her mid-spiral. "I've got 160 acres, a mortgage half paid, and a mother who thinks you hung the moon despite ruining her good flat iron. I haven't got Winthrop money, and I never will. And if that Pinkerton man walks up my lane tomorrow looking to drag you back to a wedding you ran clear across the country to escape, he's going to find out plain quick that this farm doesn't hand over what it's decided to keep. You'd stand against my uncle's whole fortune for a woman who lied to you from the platform on. I'd stand against considerably worse than that for the woman who spent 2 months proving to me, every single day, that she'd rather learn a hard thing properly than quit it easy," Jasper said. "That's not nothing, Charlotte. That's about the whole of what matters, far as I can tell." Harmon arrived at the farmhouse 2 days later, precise and unhurried, the way men are unhurried when they believe the outcome already settled in their favor. "Miss Winthrop," he said at the door, with a small correct bow that managed to convey both respect and threat in equal measure. "Your uncle has authorized me to offer a generous settlement to whoever has been harboring you, provided you return to Boston without further scandal. Mr. Crane remains willing to proceed with the marriage despite this irregularity. It would be considerably easier for everyone concerned if you came along quietly." "I'm not going back," Charlotte said, standing in her own doorway, in a plain calico dress with flowers still on her hands, looking nothing at all like the silk-clad woman who'd stepped off that train 2 months before, and every inch the equal of her. "To marry a man who values my father's company more than he ever valued me, Mr. Harmon. You may tell my uncle so plainly." "Your uncle controls the trust until your marriage, Miss Winthrop. Without it, you've nothing. No income, no inheritance, no standing. You'd be choosing poverty." "I'd be choosing honesty," Charlotte said, "which is a good deal more than my uncle's arrangement ever offered me. And I wouldn't call this poverty, Mr. Harmon. I'd call it the first home I've ever had where nobody wanted anything from me but myself." Harmon's gaze slid to Jasper, standing beside her with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way that told anyone with sense he wasn't moving. "And you, sir, prepared to marry a woman with nothing to her name, when the alternative is a fortune, if only you'd persuade her to see reason." "I asked the agency for a sturdy farm wife," Jasper said. "Got considerably more than I bargained for instead, and I've made my peace with that a good while back. Ask your Mr. Crane if he's prepared to love a woman for herself alone, same as I am, and see what answer that question gets you in Boston." "You understand, Miss Winthrop, that your uncle will not simply accept this," Harmon said, gathering his hat, his precise manner faltering just slightly into something almost like genuine warning rather than threat. "He has built a considerable career on never once accepting a loss gracefully. I have worked for the man 11 years, and I have never seen him abandon a position he considered rightfully his." "Then he'll have to grow accustomed to disappointment, Mr. Harmon, same as the rest of us occasionally must." Charlotte held the door a moment longer, some fragment of the old Boston manners surfacing despite herself. "For whatever it's worth, I don't hold the errand against you personally. You've simply been sent to collect a debt that was never rightly owed." Harmon paused at that, something almost like respect crossing his careful features before he settled his hat and turned toward his waiting horse. "For whatever it's worth, Miss Winthrop, I rather hope the farmer proves worth what you're forfeiting for him." Harmon, to his credit, seemed to understand a lost cause when confronted with one, and took his leave without further threat, though he warned, before departing, that Cornelius Winthrop was not a man inclined to accept defeat gracefully, and that further trouble might yet follow. It followed within the fortnight, in the shape of Alistair Crane himself, arriving in Rattlesnake Bend with a lawyer and a look of a man who had traveled a great distance chiefly to be inconvenienced. Charlotte, Crane's greeting, delivered on the farmhouse porch with the whole Boggs family and half the curious town gathered to watch, carried no warmth whatsoever, only the flat irritation of a man whose merger had developed complications. "This has gone on long enough. I've come to escort you home myself and put an end to this embarrassing episode." "There's no episode to end, Mr. Crane. I left because I chose to, and I'm staying because I choose to still." "You're staying in a farmhouse, Charlotte, with a man who milks his own cows and mends his own fences, when you could have Boston society, a shipping fortune, a life of considerable ease." "I could have a life of considerable ease with a man who never once looked at me the way Jasper Boggs looked at me the day I fell face first into his milking stool," Charlotte said, and beside her Jasper's mouth twitched despite the tension of the moment. "You've never asked me a single question about myself in 3 years of courtship, Alistair. Not one. Jasper asked me what I wanted my first week here, and every week since, and it took a runaway train ride and a ruined batch of bread for me to understand what an actual question sounds like, coming from a man who means it." Crane's lawyer cleared his throat and murmured something about the trust provisions, about forfeiture, about the considerable sum Charlotte stood to lose by refusing to return. And Charlotte, standing on Jasper Boggs's porch in a plain calico dress with her hands rough from honest work for the first time in her life, found she did not care in the slightest. "Then I forfeit it," she said. "Every last dollar of it gladly, if the alternative is a lifetime tied to a man who wanted my father's company more than he ever wanted me." Crane's composure slipped, briefly, into something like genuine astonishment, as though it had genuinely never occurred to him that a Winthrop might choose a farmer's mended fences over a merger's considerable ease. "You're a fool, Charlotte. This arrangement won't last. Farm life will grind the shine off you soon enough, and you'll come crawling back to Boston wanting what you've thrown away." "I've already had the shine ground off, Mr. Crane," Charlotte said, "and found underneath it a woman I like considerably better than the one Boston raised. I'll not be crawling anywhere." Crane turned his attention to Jasper then, sizing him up the way he might have appraised a competitor's shipping fleet, cold and assessing. "And you'll simply stand there and let her forfeit a fortune. Out of what pride? Sentiment? You could have a wealthy wife and this farm both, Boggs, if you'd only encourage her to reconcile with her uncle instead of feeding her these notions of independence." "I didn't ask for a wealthy wife," Jasper said, evenly. "Asked for a sturdy one. Got the sturdiest woman I ever met instead, and I'll not be the one advising her to trade that for a fortune that never once made her happy in 3 years of trying. Seems to me you've had your answer plain enough, Mr. Crane. I'd suggest you take it before you wear out the last of this town's patience standing on my porch." Crane left within the hour, his lawyer trailing after him with papers no one had signed, and Mabel Cross, who had come out onto her own porch down the lane to watch the whole spectacle unfold along with half the curious town, was heard to remark afterward that she'd never in her life seen a fine Boston gentleman sent off with his tail so thoroughly between his legs, and that whatever else might be said of the runaway heiress, the woman plainly knew her own mind, which was more than Mabel could say for most of the eligible young women she'd tried for years to match with Jasper Boggs. She brought over a jar of her own preserves the following week, by way of what passed in Rattlesnake Bend, for an apology, and allowed, grudgingly, that she supposed the arrangement might last after all. And word came within the month, via a brief and businesslike letter from her uncle's own solicitor, that Cornelius Winthrop, faced with a niece who would not be moved, and a scandal he could no longer contain quietly, had settled a modest portion of her mother's own separate inheritance on Charlotte directly. Not the whole Winthrop fortune, which remained tangled in Cornelius's management and Crane's ambitions, but enough, delivered by wire to the bank in town, to clear the last of the mortgage on the Boggs farm outright and leave a comfortable sum besides. "You didn't have to send it back," Jasper said. When she told him she meant to use every dollar toward paying down land that was, strictly speaking, already his. "It's not about what I have to do," Charlotte said. "It's about what I choose to, same as everything else since that train platform. I'd rather build something with you free and clear than carry one more debt from a life I ran from on purpose." They married that autumn, in the small church at Rattlesnake Bend, with Ruth Boggs weeping happily in the front pew, Mabel Cross seated respectably beside her own daughter 2 rows back, and half the town turned out to see the runaway heiress marry the plainspoken farmer she deceived her way into meeting. Old Pete Dunmore gave the bride away, since Charlotte had no father living to do it, and had asked him plainly the week before, touched nearly speechless when he agreed. If anyone in the congregation still found the whole story faintly scandalous, they kept it to themselves, because it was plain to everyone watching that Jasper Boggs had gotten, in the end, exactly the wife he needed, even if she'd arrived nothing at all like the one he thought he'd ordered. The wheat came in that fall thicker than it had in 3 seasons, as though the land itself had decided to reward the two of them for weathering everything the summer had thrown at them. And Charlotte stood in the field the afternoon of the harvest watching Jasper work, her own hands calloused now in ways her uncle's Boston physicians would have been horrified to examine, and found she would not have traded a single blister for the whole of the Winthrop fortune she'd left behind. "I believe I still owe you an apology," Charlotte told him that evening, standing in the kitchen that had become entirely her own, "for the letters, for the lying, for every single thing that went sideways between that platform and this kitchen." "You owe me nothing of the sort," Jasper said, drawing her in against him, work-roughened hand against her work-roughened hand, 2 people entirely remade by 2 months neither of them had planned for. "Asked the agency for a sturdy farm wife, plain-spoken and capable. Took me exactly 1 look at you falling over that milking stool to understand the agency had sent me something a good deal better than I knew enough to ask for. A poor substitute, though. I still can't manage a pie crust to save my life." "No," Jasper agreed, smiling the slow, unhurried smile she had come, in 2 short months, to love better than any fortune Boston had ever offered her. "But you learn to want to, Charlotte Boggs, and there's not a sturdier thing in this whole wide world than a person willing to keep learning, year after year, for the sake of somebody they've freely chosen. That's the whole of what I asked for, near as I can rightly figure it, even if I didn't have the good sense at the time to know it."